Hello and welcome to On the Cube Leadership Podcast episode. Well, this might have an out of place number, so I won't mention the number because today we're going to talk about the midterms because the US midterm elections just kind of still in their final results, but have kind of like taken over the news cycle at the moment. So we felt let's take the time today to discuss some key stories in here. Now, remember, we are not political commentators. We don't know all the story. Neither of us are American. But there was a couple of key things that we actually felt we could learn as leaders. And remember, all of these stories that we share are focused on more what we can learn to improve, to build our own leadership and to become better leaders because, we're on a mission to eradicate the world of poor leadership, and we can only do that by becoming ourselves better leaders. And so we're going to learn from some of these stories today. I'll probably get my video editors and my social media team to post this up before some of the other episodes. So some of our episodes might be slightly out of time, but as usual, we are joined here with Dr. Rod St. Hill, the business pastor. And Dr. Rod, thank you, and looking forward to discussing some midterm elections with you.
Well, it's good to be with you, and so am I. I'm looking forward to our discussion.
Awesome. Well, let's get straight into it. So the first thing, and because today we're going to be talking about the midterms, obviously most of it is going to be talk about from a political perspective. So we're not going to do our normal structure of looking at pop culture and looking at the business world and political world and ministry and everything. We're just going to generally look at the midterms, and there's a couple of key stories that we can take from it. But one of the first things, actually, Dr. Rod, that you shared was something that you were inspired, or that impacted you from these midterm elections as a lot is obviously both you and I, we follow a few key, let's call them YouTubers or media influencers, whatever, that are political commentators themselves. I'm not going to name and shame any of them, but you addressed today that it's quite interesting how the people that are meant to be conservatives tend to be a little bit more biased, and they're quite openly honest about their biases towards, center right. But it's you brought up the point of it's amazing how negative they are, and that we as leaders, if we're trying to influence and become better leaders ourselves and try to become a positive influence on the world, it's pretty difficult when all we're doing is being negative. Because I saw some of the commentators today speaking about what's happening in these midterm elections from really such a negative, and actually even one, like I said, I'm not going to name and shame. He even turned around today and said, today was a negative podcast because I'm just in a bad mood because it should have been a different result. Dr. Rod, how should we, or how can we present ourselves in a way where we can still be strong with our views, but not be negative?
Well, it's a big challenge, and I suppose I should first make it very clear that I am conservative with a small c.
Yeah.
I'm a Pentecostal pastor, so you would expect that. I believe that the Bible is God's truth, and so my attitude towards most of the issues that we discuss are very strongly based on biblical principles. So people need to know that right up front. Secondly, of course, this is a leadership podcast, and of course, even in the context that we're talking today, we're still looking at what lessons can we learn in terms of improving our leadership. And as you said, Craig, I shared with you off air my feeling that so many of the conservative commentators have really been very, very negative over a long period of time. And one of the things I've noticed, because I do follow a lot of conservative commentators, both here in Australia and in the United States and also in the United Kingdom. And I certainly do agree broadly with their diagnosis of what the issues are.
Yeah.
And broadly speaking, the far left are in the ascendant, and they're almost certainly sort of influenced by cultural Marxism, and that's been going on for a long time now. It certainly goes back to the early 20th century, and the momentum has been building steadily since around about the 1970s. And so what we're observing is the culmination of a process that's been going on really for 100 years. And more or less at the same time that that's been going on, the influence of Christianity has been declining, at least in the Western world. That is not true in some other parts of the world. But in the Western world, in the higher income countries, the influence of Christianity has been declining. And one of the things I've noticed about many of the commentators is that they are incredibly negative. And by the way, they're not all Christians. Many of them are openly atheistic, but they are conservative. What I've noticed is they're very, very good at being able to articulate what is wrong with the policies that are being implemented and what is wrong with the worldview held by the people who have most influence in the development of the policies. But what they don't do very well, in my view, is offer an actual solution.
Yeah.
And I think as leaders, it's one thing for us to identify issues, to identify problems. In other words, it's good for us to be good at the diagnostic side of things, but we also have to have the vision to be able to offer solutions. And I think one of the issues that we've seen in this particular election is that the conservative commentators have been pretty good at saying there's a lot wrong with what's going on at the moment, and really their only solution has been to vote differently.
Yeah.
And I doubt that that's been all that persuasive, because really to convince people to vote differently, you've really got to offer them something that is different. And I'm not convinced that we've been offering people a really good, solid alternative.
Yeah.
And in fact, I would go so far as to say, and I need to be careful in saying this, and really this is probably more of a hypothesis at the moment than anything. I do wonder whether the very negative approach taken by the conservative commentators, including those who are Christian, actually has an influence in the spiritual realm, and that does affect the outcomes of things like the midterm elections. That's just food for thought, something perhaps people might like to discuss once this video is published.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you hear these, let's say these conservative commentators that do lots of tours and speeches and everything like that, and they talk down about the protesters that come to their events that are all negative, that they're like, we're just here to present a thought, and the other people, they won't even hear the discussion, they're just negative, and there's all this attack against, let's call it the left, that they can't handle discussions, they're just being negative, and they just throw insults, everything like that. Well, when you watch a lot of the conservative commentators, they too are just throwing mud, so to speak, from their own platform, you know. Now, we discussed earlier off air that, yeah, look, it's okay if you're quite overtly that you're like, I'm a conservative and we are a conservative platform and that's what we're presenting, you know, like that's okay, because people can share their own thoughts and everything like that. But I think it's interesting that it's very easy for us to judge someone else for what they're doing wrong, and in that judging, we too are doing almost the same thing that we are judging them for.
Yes, to a large extent, I think that's true. That you know, the way to counter mudslinging is not necessarily to sling mud as well.
Yes.
And you know, I think it's fine to couch a discussion in terms of, look, we actually fundamentally disagree with the approach being taken because our worldviews are different. The way in which we interpret what goes on in the world is different. And here are some solutions. And, these are solutions which ought to be offered up by a political alternative.
Yes.
So, to take one of the big discussions in the United States, of course, has been the change in the High Court's attitude towards abortion. Now, on one level, all it does is shift responsibility back to the states, where many people would say that it always was a state responsibility to define the law on abortion, and all that the High Court did in the United States was to restore the right of individual states to make up their minds, and that for sure is true. But then I haven't heard any of these commentators discuss things like the role that domestic violence plays in abortion. I think we need, us on the conservative side, we need to acknowledge, for example, that there are many women who are forced into abortion, for example, because they are victims of domestic violence. And we know that domestic violence increases when a woman becomes pregnant. And so many seek abortions because they hope that might protect them from further abuse, further violence. What are we offering to help those women, or to make those women feel that they will still be safe in a different legal environment? These are the sorts of things I mean by we have to be able to offer an alternative solution. So I think it's great that we're saying, look, we want to protect life. Life begins at conception, and therefore abortion is murder. I agree with all of that. But what are we offering to the individuals who find themselves in a position where they believe that the only way out for them, because, for example, they're victims of domestic violence, the only way out for them is an abortion? So, we need to be able to offer solutions. Now, actually, the long-term solution is stable marriage between a man and a wife. And we know
healthy,
that's what
marriage.
The data show, that the safest place for a woman is within the boundaries, as it were, of traditional marriage. It's also the safest place for children. So we need to be saying, well, what we're going to do is we're going to put a lot of effort and resources into making marriages better, making marriage a viable option for many people who at the moment don't think it is. So we need to offer solutions like that. We need to offer solutions to the high cost of energy. And one of the things that interested me during many of the debates in relation to the midterm elections in the United States was, and I may be quite wrong because I'm in Australia, I don't hear everything, but I didn't hear a solid commitment to becoming self-sufficient in energy again. Now, I could be totally wrong on that, but I would have thought
there wasn't much of that. Obviously, I'm closer to there, and there didn't seem to be much comment on that. I agree with you. I think that, like, something that I wrote down as you were talking I think it's the difference between being critical and analytical.
That's a good point.
I agree with you. We just be critical and criticize people, we're no better than anyone else, right? We're not adding any value to the conversation. We're not, one thing that you and I spoke about just before this is some of the comments that we're getting on our YouTube videos. There's some of them that are just critical of something, of either you or I or what we're talking about, and they've completely missed what we're actually discussing. We're discussing about how we can become better leaders, and even there were some of the comments that were almost in direct contradiction to exactly what we shared, and it's just because some people are just bent on being critical, right? I'm gonna keyboard warriors and everything like that, and I suppose, as a bit of a side note, guys, if you're getting anything positive from these videos, if you're learning anything about your leadership, if you're being personally challenged with your leadership, put a comment below. Let's fill the comments below with positivity, with encouragement, with hey, I learned this, or this really made me think about that. Wouldn't that be a better environment rather than just being critical, right? Let's be analytical, because I think that that's what should set us apart as great leaders. Is a leader that just goes around and criticizes everything. We all know them. It's a negative environment to work in. It's a bad place to be a part of. Like, people don't flourish in those sorts of, and we all know leaders like that. We also have all been leaders like that. I know that I can find myself to be very critical. But I suppose a bit of a revelation, as we've been discussing this, Dr. Rod, is making that transition from just being critical to being analytical. It's the shift of what I believe is, like you said, is finding a solution or looking at it objectively and trying to figure out and having an open mind and looking at all the facts, because that's what you do when you analyze something. You look at all the facts and you try to draw in as much information as you can. Dr. Rod, you've always got a bit of a story to share about your leadership experience. What's a time when you've experienced, or you yourself have been critical versus analytical, or made the shift yourself?
Well, certainly before I became a Christian, I was Mr. Critical. I was the kind of person who always blamed someone else or blamed circumstances for my own, the own state that I was in, or whatever I was experiencing myself. And, I had many years of practice, so I got pretty good at it. But I think once I became a Christian, I began to understand things quite differently. And that is, like, when people hurt me or did something I didn't like, it was more sin than anything else. And, sin undermines everything.
Yeah.
And we have to understand that a lot of what's going on in our world today is really the outcome of sin.
Yep.
And I've become very, very conscious in recent years that we need to think generously, speak generously, and act generously, even in a context where we're dealing with people with whom we have deep disagreements.
Yeah.
Now, I certainly have deep disagreements with politicians and others, of course, who believe in abortion up until birth, and euthanasia and many other things. But I think I've come to understand that we live in a world which is marred by sin. And we certainly live in a world in which love is growing cold. That agape love, the God type of love, is growing cold, even among Christians. And that often shows up in the comments we make publicly about others. And certainly that happens in the context of politics, but it happens in other contexts as well. So look, I think I'm becoming better at the art of loving those I perceive to be my enemies, and understanding that their wrong thinking is really a reflection of the state of the world, the fact that we live in a fallen world.
Yeah.
But also I do feel more and more responsible for not only pointing out or diagnosing issues and problems, but also finding solutions. Now, ultimately, the answer to all our questions is Jesus.
Yeah.
But like in the public square, we can't say the answer to all of humanity's problems is Jesus.
Yeah.
Because that sounds stupid. And it will be received as such by people who really don't know where I'm coming from.
Yeah.
For me, Jesus responded to the disciples when they asked him, what will be the signs at the end of the age? And that's all set out in Matthew 24 and 25. And I think we're living in those times now. So we're getting very, very close to end times. As David Jeremiah says, we shouldn't be thinking it's the end of the world. We should be thinking that we're living in the world of the end. And I think that's a very wise statement.
Yeah.
And we should frame our own thinking of the world in that context. We're living in the world of the end. And so what we're seeing around us shouldn't really surprise us, nor should it cause us to fear.
Yeah.
We should maintain our confidence in the truth of God's word, maintain our confidence and our hope in the promises of God's word. And in the meantime, we need to be in the world, but
Yeah.
not of the world.
Yeah.
We need to fearlessly and steadfastly state our position. And yes, we should be putting up our alternatives in the political realm as well as every other realm.
Yeah.
So, our area, our chosen area is leadership. So we need to continue to diagnose and teach on leadership because we want better leadership in the world. And ultimately, of course, your big, hairy, audacious goal is to rid the world of poor leadership.
Yeah.
So everything that we do, even on this podcast, should be pointing people towards better leadership based on the examples that we see in everyday life around us. Now, I don't know whether that's really answered the question, but it did give me an opportunity to say something that's on my heart.
That's good. No, we never know where these things are going. That's okay. It's a discussion. You emphasize the fact that you didn't always be analytical. You have been critical. I would echo the same, that I actually feel like, the idea of there's two edges to one sword, right? That some things, like, so for example, a box of matches is great, but it can also be dangerous, right? And I believe that happens with our gifts. And in our leadership program, we actually talk about, the balconies and basements, or the advantages and disadvantages, or the challenges and opportunities from each of our gifts or callings or whatever. And yeah, that bit of a shameless plug, leadership program, free leadership program down below. Go check it out. The being critical is the same gift as being analytical, but it's just used obviously in a negative way, where I believe one gift that God has given me is been able to identify issues and find solutions for it. However, when I'm in a selfish mindset, or maybe in a bad mood, or in a place of lack, or in a place where I'm more self-focused, I can be really critical, and not analytical. And it's affected my relationships in the past because I've been over critical rather than being analytical. It's hurt me when I look back to some of my earlier leadership roles. I was really good at identifying problems, and so I kind of felt that was my job to call out the problems, but without finding a solution for them, or without offering a solution for them. And I can see that as I have matured in life and in leadership, that making that transition from critical to analytical has made me a better leader, but also made me more tolerable, to live with, and to be around. It's much more enjoyable to be around someone who's analytical rather than critical. So please, let us encourage you as a leader. Be warned about being critical about the things that are around you. Let's shift that to being analytical and trying to figure out how we can then use that to find solutions, discuss alternatives to whatever it is we're facing, rather than just being negative and critical. And remember, this podcast, as we've kind of mentioned a few times, is about us trying to be analytical. Remember, we're not being critical of the person. And we've also mentioned a couple of times here about on a mission to eradicate poor leadership. That's not the person. We're not here to eradicate people, right? And it's the poor leadership is not about the person, it's about the behavior. And that's us being analytical rather than critical, because we're not criticizing a person. We're analyzing the events and finding how we, from what we know, can be better leaders. And I hope that you can learn to do that too. And let's transition that to be analytical about something that a leader did that we believe is poor leadership. Obviously, these midterms are really important. Obviously, there's a lot of weight around them, and it's interesting that the leader of one of the parties, or let's say leader of one of the parties, decided to interrupt the great momentum that they were getting and kind of hint to bring attention back to him, right? Yes, we're talking about the big red baby. That's what they call him, the big red baby or whatever. that joke of Donald Trump. Now, we've mentioned him a number of times on this podcast. Like we said, let's not be critical of the person. Let's be analytical of the behavior. We actually find it really interesting that the day before midterm elections were about to happen, Donald Trump doesn't announce. He just releases a statement where he teases that there's going to be a special announcement next week or a big announcement next week. Whereas obviously we assume he's going to announce that he's going to be running for president in 2024. Dr. Rod, when you're leading an organization and they're at this crucial point of a project or driving towards a particular outcome, and you then interrupt the progress to then draw attention back to yourself that's kind of irrelevant, what's your take on that as a leader?
Well, I feel very uncomfortable about it. My thoughts when I heard what President Trump had done was, look, really, this is the last thing that is needed at this point in the campaign. And the reason is that Donald Trump is polarizing.
Yes.
And there'll be people who may have been thinking about voting Republican who change their minds. Now, we won't know that for sure. There may be some post-vote polling that is done that might help us come to understand that a little better. But the problem is Donald Trump is a polarizing influence. He has a hard core of very strong supporters. Then there are those who would rather him just retire and kind of fade away, as it were, and put all his energy into his presidential library or something like that. But I think it was particularly poorly timed. Look, President Trump did some very, very good things while he was in office. Many of the outcomes of his presidency were really very positive for the United States. And unlike many other presidents, he did exactly what he said he was going to do during his presidency. There's no doubt about that. Certainly got scores on the board, certainly deserves some points for that. However, his flaw, I think, was that he was very strongly self-centered. Now, I don't necessarily mean that means he's selfish, but he was very strongly centered on himself and his own interest. And I think that has probably ended up costing him personally, and may well have actually cost him a second term as president. But look, I know I've used this term often during our conversations, Craig, but he was unwise to do that. He was unwise to make an announcement of any kind on the eve of the elections, but even more unwise to say, this is an announcement about an announcement I'm going to make. And there's a whole lot of reasons why he shouldn't have done that. But the main reason, I think, is that it was clearly going to be unsettling for a lot of people who may have... You see, elections at the end of the day, they're not really determined. The outcomes are not determined by the strong supporters, the people who are rusted on, as it were. They're determined by people in the middle who, right up until they go into the polling booth to cast their vote, they're still not 100% certain for whom they're going to cast their vote. And I'm sure that was as true in the midterm elections as it has been at any time in the past. And so someone who has so much influence, not from position, he doesn't hold a particular formal position within the party, but he wields a great deal of influence because he is an influential leader.
Yeah.
But I honestly think he lacks wisdom, and I think, I mean, I said this about him many times during his presidency as well, that the way in which he managed social media, yes, he needed to counter the legacy media because the legacy media simply became an arm of opposition to all things conservative. There's no doubt about that. But I do think that much of what he did was very unwise, and he's just continued.
Yeah.
And look, my understanding is that he could have set up a commission of inquiry into the 2020 elections that could not have been closed down by the next administration, but he didn't do that. And as I think I've actually shared here before, I think his antics during the what do they call them, the repeat elections in Georgia, actually probably cost the Republicans the majority that they would otherwise have had in the Senate, those runoff elections. That's somewhat unique to the state of Georgia, and I see that the state of Georgia is going to have runoffs again for the Senate. So honestly, I think he would have been doing the party a favour by not saying anything. But the worst thing was to say, I'm going to make an announcement about an announcement I'm going to make.
An announcement about
an
announcement.
Not good form at all.
Yeah.
Very disappointing. Very disappointing.
And I think that, once again, drawing it back onto ourselves as leaders is, it's really important for us to, let's say, read the room, right?
Yes.
Like, I think that there's a good leader isn't necessarily the person that is always pushing, because sometimes a leader keeps their mouth shut, keeps in the quiet, like just sometimes our team are just on a roll. We don't need to go out there and, all right, team, we need to do this. We don't need to call another meeting. We don't need to be involved or go and micromanage or whatever. Sometimes a good leader knows when to just stay out, right? My team are doing great. Actually, it's quite interesting that I've been coaching business owners for now 11 years, and every single time the business owner goes away on a holiday, they come back and the business is running better every single time. Not like in some of the cases, but every single time they've come back to the business being in better condition and operating better than when they're in it, right? Because sometimes it's really important for the leader to just let the team do what they're doing, right? And I feel like we do that because our own insignificance, right? We want to feel a significance in a moment. We might be feeling a lack of, oh, maybe I need to be doing something. I'm not doing anything as leader, so I need to be doing something. Or maybe the team are getting a great result and we kind of, there's a bit of insecurity or jealousy or something like that we're trying to overcome or whatever. And I find it quite interesting that we as leaders, and I think that this is kind of the perfect metaphor of it, is we need to be able to read the room. We need to be able to know when to speak and when not to speak. This is, I admit, Dr. Rod, one of my big challenges. I remember just before I left Australia, we were invited to be represented at a fairly influential meeting, and considering on what an an Australian-wide association, what their move forward was going to be and everything like that. And we were fortunate enough to be invited along there. And one of the biggest challenges I had in that meeting was keeping my mouth shut, right? Because it's like, sometimes we feel the need to show how much we know, right? And other times, sometimes it's just important just to sit back. And I mean, that room was full of incredibly wise, experienced, influential leaders of the faith from across the state. And there's a lot to learn from a lot of people. And so I went into that meeting saying to myself, I'm not going to say a thing. I'm not going to say a thing because I just want to sit back and hear what everyone has to say. Now, as you would remember in that meeting, it seemed to get a little quiet. No one was saying anything. So I felt prompted to then, okay, I read the room. Now's the time to share, right? And so I think that that's probably really important for us as leaders to know when to speak and when not to speak, when to contribute, when not to contribute, when to manage and when not to manage, when to kind of allow people to be free. And I think that this is an example of a time that we need, that the leader should have just let his team do their thing.
Yeah, and look, the other comment I would make on that, Craig, and I fully support what you say, is that, you know, leadership isn't about the leader. The focus should rarely be on the leader. The focus should be on the vision.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So, you know, the vision that Donald Trump has, make America great again, that's actually a good vision.
Yes.
And look, I think you could do a lot with that. It may be tarnished now, of course, but certainly during his term as president, there's so much he did, in a sense, to make America great again.
Yeah.
And you look at very high rates of employment, particularly among blacks and Hispanics, the self-sufficiency in energy, the remarkable progress he made in the Middle East, the fact that America was able to maintain its stance in the world during his presidency without actually starting another war. That's something quite unique, in fact. So there are many things.
And the economic, come on, you're an economist. You're an economist, and you didn't mention the economy.
Oh, well, unemployment's related to the economy, of course, but the economy grew. Like there were so many good stories there, and so much of that has disappeared from the United States in 2 years, less than 2 years actually. And if the focus had been on a vision for America, things might have turned out differently. So we need to be very and look, one of the traps, you see, leaders often become leaders because they're charismatic. The downside of being a charismatic leader is that you tend to focus on yourself.
Yes.
Because a charismatic leader attracts followers, and you end up, I think, often looking, well, how many followers have I got? What are my followers saying about me? What are my followers thinking about me? And if you're not getting the right signals from your followers, then you do something to bring the focus back on you. But in fact, that's the downside of being a charismatic leader. And you've really got to focus on the vision. And I think one of the reasons why businesses do quite well when the leader is gone is because when the leader's out, it's the vision that remains.
That's great.
And I would suggest that if the leader goes altogether, things might not continue as well as they otherwise might. But certainly for a short time, when the leader's gone, their direct influence is also gone. And so you're actually left with the vision that the leader has provided. So
that's really good.
You need to focus on vision, and I think that holds in politics as it does in business, as it does in ministry.
And to add to that, Dr. Rod, is yes, the vision is important, but also I feel like there are a lot of leaders are too focused on their vision and not focused on the people that they're being called to impact, or the people that are being called to assist them achieve the vision. which kind of leads us to the next point. Another Trump story, but how we often as leaders get too caught up in the vision and forget the people. And we think that the people are just there to serve us to achieve the vision. No, like Jesus said, I've come to serve, not be served, right? The vision is not yours, and those people are not there to serve you and your vision. God has given you a vision, and you are leading the way, but there's also other people that God has called to that same vision that happens to be aligned with you. And we are there called to then serve those people, build them up, and encourage them. Let's talk about building people up and encouraging our team, that it's not just about the vision. Let's talk about Trump. So there was an interview with Trump recently on News Nation that actually aired on Tuesday, and this was his quote. "Well, I think if they win, I should get all the credit," Trump said in an interview. "And if they lose, I should not be blamed for it at all. But it will probably be just the opposite." Dr. Rod, if we win, it's all because of me. If we lose, it's all your fault. What's your take?
Okay to think it, not so good to say it. No, look, I think as leaders, yep, we can take some accolades when we get things right. When things don't go so well, we should just bear it. That's part of being a good leader.
Yeah.
And not only that, you should support your people.
Yes.
One aspect about being a good leader is you go in and defend your people.
Mm-hmm.
It's really important to do that. Now, I've done that at personal cost to me. In fact, I made a decision once that I'd have to leave a job because I was then working for someone who was the owner of a business. I was running the business, but I was running it on their behalf. And I made a decision which was clearly a decision to protect staff. I defended staff, but that, of course, brought me the ire of the owner. But I thought, no, look, part of my role as a leader is to, as it were, to stick up to defend my staff, mm-hmm. which I did at personal cost to me, and I did eventually leave that job. But sometimes that will happen. But look, I think in general, when I read that quote and when we were talking prior to coming on air, I searched for that quote and I found it. It seems to be a direct quote from President Trump. And by the way, I don't like referring to him as Trump.
Yes.
And I tend to be quite careful. He is President Trump. Mm-hmm. In the United States, of course, once president, you're always president. And I do think we should refer to them as President Trump. That's just a little funny thing with me. And I like to accord people that level of courtesy and respect.
I would agree with you, Dr. Rod. I think one of the challenges that I find is having followed him for so long and him being Trump, like I've followed his career for a very long time.
Yes, yes, of course.
And yes, you are right. And thank you for correcting. Yes, we should show honor where honor is due. He held that position, so he has the right to that title. It's very difficult because, to me, he's Trump. And
everyone calls him
that
Trump.
Happened
that's
to
true.
be.
That's right. Absolutely.
He's Trump that happened to have a bit of a fun time for 4 years in the White House, kind of running amok. But as you said, he did get some good results and did do some good things. So yes, you are correct on that.
He actually did a lot more in office than most presidents before him.
Yep.
In terms of getting policy through, and that he probably doesn't receive enough recognition for that. But nevertheless, the statement that he made is it's okay to think it, but I would never recommend to a leader that they actually say something like that, because I think that deflates people's confidence in them as a leader. Well, if we work hard and things go right, the leader's going to take all the credit, And if we work hard and things go wrong, we're going to get all the blame.
Yeah.
And that's not good for people.
Yeah. I'm as you're saying, I'm trying to remember who it was, but there was, the name has escaped me. I've got it written down somewhere because it's going to be a story that I share and probably something that I create on social media. But there was a captain or a coach of a sporting team, and I can't even remember who it was, that they were notoriously known for whenever the team won, it was always about the team. It was always the team did great, they got good results, they worked together, they followed the plan, but every time they always put it on themselves and they said, yep, I didn't lead the team properly today. It was my fault. It was wrong strategy. It was wrong, and I think that we as leaders, like you said, we need to protect our team. We need to take the brunt. Now, this doesn't mean we don't hold our team accountable. We still hold them accountable for making mistakes, etc. But I think we need to stand up, and when we win, we've got to remember it's because of the team that they've won. When we lose, we have to take ownership. We have to protect them on an outwardly basis. Like I said, we do still need to hold them accountable. Like we're not saying that people skate by without any consequences. There's still consequences. But if we win, it's because of the team. If we lose, we need to take our responsibility, stand up, and protect the team. Because, well, let's be honest, no matter how good we are, we couldn't do it without the team. No matter how good we are, and no matter how bad the team is perceived to be, we still couldn't have done it without their help. And so if we won, it's because of the team. If we lose, we do need to take accountability. We as leaders, the buck stops with us. If it failed because we allowed something to happen. And then in private, we have conversations with the team. So let's transition into our next topic, talking about winning and losing and taking credit for the win and blaming others for the loss. Obviously, leading up to these midterm elections, one of the big terms that have been thrown around was the red wave. It was expected that the Republicans would just wipe the floor with the Democrats, and they seemingly had every opportunity to. However, it was funny, on Ben Shapiro's show on the Daily Wire, his title for his show today was Red Wave, Red Trickle, because that's what it ended up being. If I look at actually what is the current results, right now the Senate is sitting at 56 seats to Democrats and 48 to the Republicans. Right? There's not that much of a difference. And then if you look at the House, similar story. It's not a runaway. It's 184 seats to 207. There's still a number of seats to be decided in both, and it's still underway. But it's quite interesting that it wasn't a runaway. It wasn't this red wave like they were expecting. And one of the things that Ben Shapiro did actually comment on was the fact that, well, there was one red wave. And it was a wave where, it was a nice wave considering that state has just put up with physical waves crashing their state with the latest hurricanes that have just gone through. But Florida, obviously, both in the Senate and in the House, Ron DeSantis won governor again, but there were so many seats that were previously blue seats that are now red seats, and by quite a convincing mile. There was a red wave there. And it's interesting that there was this red wave in Florida and New York as well. But the rest of the country, it was kind of normal. There was a couple of seats that went against and a couple of seats that went for and whatever. And he commented the fact that the difference is in Florida and New York, they were running on substance. They were running on results. Obviously, Governor DeSantis has gotten a lot of great results, but they also ran on substance. Conversely, you look at some of the other seats. We spoke about Fetterman, previously on a podcast. He surprisingly won against Dr. Oz, who was President Trump's nomination or his support. He threw his support behind him, and it's funny that Ben Shapiro was saying that Trump seemed to support a lot of people because of their fame, like Dr. Oz. And actually, you mentioned before that Dr. Oz doesn't even live in the area, hasn't got any experience or any results in government or in politics or anything like that. And it's funny that you see a red wave in Florida and New York, but because there was substance, but then everywhere else it was just ho-hum and just kind of normal because there was no substance.
Yes, in general, incumbents were returned, and that's fairly common in elections. There definitely was a red wave in Florida, and I've heard some commentators say it has now flipped from a blue state to a red state, which is rather an achievement. And of course, Ron DeSantis, he won with around about a 20-point advantage, which is very, very substantial. He had runs on the board, of course. He took big risks during COVID, and he implemented policies that kind of went against what was then the received wisdom and turned out to be right. He's also stood up against the administration, particularly over border issues, but he's got other runs on the board as well. Now, I think one of the things about Ron DeSantis, which I think has probably worked in his favor, is that during the aftermath of the hurricanes, he clearly worked in partnership with the federal government.
Yeah.
And both he and Joe Biden were courteous to one another in public. Now, I think that is not lost on the voter. I remember seeing a number of media conferences in which both the president and the governor appeared, where they were quite cordial to one another publicly. So, and given that there are times when you need to have confidence that your local politicians can work with other levels, I think that Ron DeSantis got a really big tick then. And look, honestly, I felt that Joe Biden had actually shown that he was a statesman in that episode, because he also, even though perhaps temporarily, he set aside his disagreements, very public disagreements with Ron DeSantis on migration, for example. And they clearly worked together. They worked very, very quickly to bring relief certainly within 48 hours to most of those who were affected. It was far quicker than that for many others. So I think that was certainly something that served in his favor as an incumbent and saw a swing further. And I think that's affected these other seats in Florida as well. Look, Ron DeSantis didn't really have much of a profile until he started implementing policies that were different to those implemented elsewhere during COVID. That's really when he came to prominence. But he was also able to articulately defend his position.
Yes.
That also means something. And I think similar with the red wave up in New York, where a number of seats went red quite surprisingly. And I think that's because there was substance in what the alternative representatives were bringing to the people. So there's a big lesson there. Celebrity doesn't win votes.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know,
It's not about the fame.
and I think
Yeah.
that's saying something about the general voter. The general voter is not stupid. The general voter actually weighs up the pros and the cons of the different parties, the different individuals who are putting themselves up for elections, and votes accordingly.
Yeah.
And maybe the leaders of political parties, not just in the United States, but here in Australia and in the United Kingdom and Canada and elsewhere, should actually take note of that and assume that the average voter is a sensible, thoughtful person.
Yeah. And bringing this back to everyday leaders, I actually feel led to talk to ministry leaders specifically, because I know it seems like we need to become a celebrity pastor to be able to have the influence and build our church and stuff like that. And we get caught up in the fame of it all, I suppose, and chasing, feeling like we need to achieve that fame to actually have the impact. But it's proven against that. Like, this is the perfect example. Like, voters are the people that are coming to your churches and stuff like that. They're looking for substance. They're not looking for a celebrity pastor. Maybe there's some people that are transient that are looking for celebrity pastors or whatever. But at the end of the day, most of the people in your community, there are people right now that are just searching for substance. They want to know that you have something behind you, that you have something that you're making an actual impact. It's not just about the Sunday service. It's not just about how many numbers, how big your church is on a Sunday. It's about what's the substance? What's the substance of the impact that you're having on the people that are coming? Are the people that you're leading growing? You know, we've mentioned this a number of times before, Dr. Rod, that it's not about the influence, about empowerment. As a leader, the true test of our leadership is the people that are growing around us. If people aren't growing around you, there's something missing in your leadership. There's no substance there in your leadership. If we're not making a positive impact on our community, and there's actually a story we were going to talk about today, but we're going to leave that till next week, where we're talking about the impact of a local church on the community of the Gold Coast, that I'm looking forward to being able to share that. But are we just trying to build the numbers in our church? Or are we trying to build the people? Are we trying to actually make a positive impact on our community? Dr. Rod, I say this as I'm challenging pastors, and as a pastor of a church yourself, how do you feel about that comment?
Look, I agree with you. I've never been a celebrity pastor, so I don't know what it's like. I can't speak from experience. But I think the danger always, of course, is that when we're influencing a lot of people, we tend to start taking care of our image. And I think that can be a bit of a trap. It's also, I think, important to understand that most pastors are not celebrity pastors. Most churches are relatively small neighborhood churches. So the average size of churches, and this is fairly universal around the world, it's around about 30 people.
Mm-hmm.
In Australia, I think it's a little bit lower than that. The last data I saw was about 25 to 27 people. So most churches are relatively small. Most pastors are pastoring relatively small churches. And I agree with you. The main role there, we need to make disciples. So we need to be interested in our people as people, just as Jesus was. And we need to be looking at their own growth as individuals, their own growth spiritually. And that really is the measure of our success as pastors, in a leadership role as a pastor. That's the measure of our success. I'm not saying that large churches are not a good thing, because there are definitely things that large churches, mega churches can do that small churches cannot.
Yep.
And there are some, absolutely monstrous churches that are doing wonderful, wonderful things for the whole of the body of
Yes.
Christ. And look, in some cases, you can see that leaders are really focusing a little bit too much on themselves, but that's not the case universally either. And I
Yeah.
think, as leaders, let's just keep watching these and learning. Remember, this is not about trying to condemn anybody.
Yeah.
We're not, we're not a star rating agency or anything like
Yeah.
that,
No.
but we observe and we learn.
Yeah.
You look at some of the wonderful gifts to the body of Christ, like version, for example, that's come
Yes.
from a very large church, and the blessing that it has been to the whole of the body of Christ, where we can access so many resources
Yeah.
to help us in our own discipleship journey
Mm-hmm.
for free.
Yes.
A small church wouldn't be able to do that kind of thing. So
Yep.
it's good for us to understand that in the whole of the ecosystem of the church world,
Mm-hmm.
there are important roles for large and small churches.
Yeah.
And look, I know of cases of pastors of small churches who have become extremely narcissistic in their leadership
Yeah.
and really destroyed lives. So the same lessons we might observe from, large church leaders who have in some way fallen, those lessons apply to small church leaders as well. And I'm as vulnerable to that as anybody.
Yes.
And it's important for me as a pastor to make sure that I'm accountable. Our church is part of Australian Christian churches, so there's a level of accountability there. The way in which our denomination is arranged, the individual churches have a very high degree of autonomy, but we're not independent. So all of our pastors sign up to a code of conduct, and there is some watching over that. We have a system of oversight. So we have a regional leader, and he certainly knows who I am. He knows me personally. He's rung me and asked me how I'm going. So there's that level of accountability there. There's that level of interest. And I think as pastors or as Christian leaders, whether it be in business or the church world, wherever we happen to be, we're all vulnerable. So all the kinds of things you and I have been talking about today, Craig, in relation to people like President Trump, even as a pastor of a small church, and you as you're the leader of a business,
Yeah.
you and I, we're still vulnerable to exactly the same kind of thing.
100%.
We can end up displaying
Yep.
exactly the same symptoms if we're not held to account ourselves, and that's really important.
And that's why we continually try to emphasize it's not the person's behavior, because I too make mistakes. We all make mistakes, and we need to learn from these things to become better leaders and to shift our behaviors, our own,
and just
not
if
others.
I can intervene there without telling a tale out of school, so to speak. Everybody, I think, who watches this podcast know that I'm one of your accountability partners, and I do recall on one occasion saying to you directly, "You are the problem here." And then we had to work through that, and we need to be surrounded by people who love us enough to say something like that to us. Hopefully we don't have to do it very often. And in our relationship, that's only ever happened once. But I remember that. I remember saying to you, Craig, you are the problem here. And then we spent weeks after unpacking that and dealing with it. And look, as leaders, we've got to face that from time to time.
And so it's important for us to face that. And looking at this red wave that was meant to happen that didn't happen, and what can we learn from it as ministry leaders or business leaders or leaders in our community? Let's make sure we lead with substance. Let's make sure that we have substance ourselves. Make sure that we're not superficial. And I don't mean superficial as in fake or whatever. I mean superficial. Let's go deep with our knowledge. Understand what your purpose is. Go deep in what that purpose is. Like Dr. Red mentioned before, our purpose is leadership. We know that we're called to help teach and train and to shift or to eradicate poor leadership. And that's our purpose. And so we go deep into that. We create a lot of content. We research. I create leadership programs. Free leadership program below. Click the link. Another shameless plug. There's endless things. We go deep into this because we know that we're called to this. This is our substance. Not politics. We don't know politics. We're not experts on politics. We're not called to that. Not any of the other things. We're not deep. That's why we're not deep on the actual topics, but we're drawing out the metaphors from that so that we can learn to become better leaders, because that's our substance. And we hope that you can see that substance as well. And hey, if any of that substance has helped you, put a comment below. But we need to be focused on the substance of ourselves, substance of our character, substance of the impact we have on those around us, that we see that the people we're leading are growing, making sure that the community that we're a part of, that there is substance in that we are contributing to our community as a whole as well. And so what can we learn from this missed opportunity of a red wave in the midterms? Substance is what people are craving substance. And I'm sure if you can present substance and live substance, you'll start attracting people around you as well. Before we end, let's finish off with a leadership lesson from Luke. This is going to be a slightly different one today. It's not a particular passage that we're going to talk about. It's the entire book, because as Dr. Rod and I were discussing all of these points today, we felt that there was an overarching theme in here where it was actually what we believe is part of that issue of substance and part of the issues that we've been discussing today, that Luke was written different. Well, Luke was an apostle. And so the book of Luke and obviously Acts was written differently. Dr. Rod, you had a good revelation about this that I'd love for you to share, about how we can learn to become better leaders because of the way Luke, the book, was written in line with what we've been discussing today.
Well, it might come as a surprise to some people, but Luke wasn't actually an eyewitness to the things that he wrote about. He was a Gentile. Many authors say he was, in fact, a physician. But one thing is very clear: he did his research carefully. Now, he did not actually write everything that he discovered during his research. He talks about many other things. So he chose to present those things which were going to be most impactful to his intended audience. It certainly appears that his intended audience was Greek, particularly the educated Gentiles of the day. So he knew his audience, he did his research well, and he wrote for his audience. So that in itself, I think, is an important lesson for leaders. Do your research well, know who your audience is, and write or communicate for your audience. But also, you see, the Jesus that he portrayed was a Jesus who was very committed to his own assignment. And Jesus, in the way Jesus is portrayed in the book of Luke, he very strongly, two things. One is he cares enough for his disciples to spend a lot of time and effort teaching them.
Yeah.
So he modeled the discipler.
Yes.
As leaders, to a large extent, we're disciplers, in the Christian context. He himself modeled the role of discipler because he took a lot of time and effort to teach his disciples. When they asked him questions, he took the time to answer. The other thing that Luke focuses on very much is the way in which Jesus helped the poor, the needy, and the sick. His message was, to some extent, I suppose, political, because Jesus had very little time for the religious leaders of the day who were extracting wealth from
Yep.
people who were really too poor to pay. The way the whole system was rigged, it was rigged in favor of the higher echelons of the priestly class. I didn't certainly cover all of most of the priests, by the way, only served periodically, and really they had no form of sustenance when they weren't serving.
Mm-hmm.
And so most of the priests were very poor people. They were being exploited as well. And the average person was very poor. Around about a quarter of the population were actually living below starvation level. So times were pretty tough. And Jesus addressed the needs in the context of the time. And I think there's a lesson there for those of us who are in politics as well.
Yeah.
We need to focus on those people who are actually being left behind,
Yeah.
as it were, by the system. And I think one of the sad things for me about modern politics is that it seems to be geared towards the interests of the professional political class,
Yes.
not to the interests of those who are actually being left out by the system. And my view of the Bible, as you know, I'm an economist. I've got a PhD in economics. I've been an economics lecturer for virtually 40 years, and I'll probably get back into it in the next year or so. My understanding of the Word of God is that it's very strong on the need to be diligent workers. It's strong on the definition and protection of private property. So, if you like, biblical economics is pretty much the story of capitalism. However, it's also very strong on our responsibility for those who kind of fall out of the system. The Old Testament and the New Testament, to some extent, they focus on the widows and the orphans and the sojourners. And, they were kind of left out of the system back in those days. They didn't have any inheritance. They had no way of providing their own sustenance and so on. And there's much said about our need to look after the poor. And I think one of the things we can learn, particularly if we have an interest in politics, take a lesson from Luke, focus on those who are being squeezed out by the system, even if it's a good system. And I don't really talk about capitalism anymore. I prefer to talk about biblical economics. And biblical economics is strong on individual responsibility. It's strong on entrepreneurship and on innovation. It's strong on market mechanisms, and I could spend 2 or 3 hours talking about that. But it is also strong in looking after those who, for any reason, have fallen out of the system and the whole system isn't looking after them. That's what we need to focus on in politics. Yeah. And I think one of the lessons we could take from these midterm elections is that it's not good enough to simply say the ones who are in power are not delivering. You need to be able to show we really care about those who need helping, and this is how we're going to do it. Yeah. So Jesus both demonstrated his role as discipler, but he also took the context of the time in which he actually lived on earth, and he tackled the issues head on. He looked after the poor and needy, and he instructed us to do that as well.
Yeah, that's good. Obviously, the best example we can ever learn from for leadership is Jesus. I believe that's right. Yes. With no doubt, and it's not a Bible, it's not a Sunday school answer, of like Jesus is the answer. It's like, no, if you actually look at the way that he discipled, that he built people up around him, that he served community, that he served his team, he was a man of substance, was a deity of substance. Obviously, he had a lot more substance than all of us because he was the substance of God as well. So, but from the practical standpoint of his leadership was he saw the problems. Let's kind of like, what we spoke about today is he was analytical. He wasn't just critical. He addressed problems, but he provided a solution for it as well. He knew when to step back from the team and just allow the team to do their thing, and he knew the time to step in and correct the team or take charge of the team. He also knew that it wasn't about him and his glory. It was all about, obviously, the glory of the Father, but he was there to protect his team and not take the glory from the team. And he had substance. Like, that's kind of the summary of today of what you were just sharing there with how Luke himself wrote with substance. He was very detailed. He was very researched, and obviously Luke is a longer gospel than the rest because he applied more substance and more detail and research to how he presented. And obviously he presented the story of how Jesus, we as political leaders, but also as leaders, need to learn that we're here to be able to help those people that are marginalized, those people that don't have a voice, those people that are in need, as Dr. Rod shared. Dr. Rod, thank you. Midterms. It's provided us quite a substantial conversation today, which is interesting. Do you have any last comments about the midterms and how we as leaders can learn from this and become better leaders?
Well, I suppose, the final comment would have to be, let's not look towards what's happening in this temporal world, but let's look toward eternity as leaders. And, we might be disappointed by the outcome of the midterm elections. That's one level, and, it's okay to be disappointed, but let's keep our focus on Jesus.
Yeah.
Let's understand that, as David Jeremiah says, let's not focus on the end of the world, but focus on the world at the end.
Yeah.
All of us who are Christian leaders, we've still got a role to play. Let's keep loving our people. Let's keep leading our people. Let's keep ensuring that the focus is not on us. Let's maintain the vision, and let's continue to disciple those who are our followers.
That's great. And guys, remember, whatever the results of any election, wherever you are in the world, at the end of the day, remember, there's only one person sitting on the throne. There's only one person that is in control. Well, I say person loosely, God. No matter who is president, no matter who is governor, no matter who is prime minister, no matter who is our local councillor, at the end of the day, God is still on the throne. God is still in all sovereignty, in all control of the world. We need to continue to place our faith in God, not in man. No president, no governor is going to save us. No prime minister is going to save us individually. There's only one who saves. Jesus saves, and he's sitting on the throne. And so please remember that these things, as Dr. Rob mentioned, all these things happen in a temporal home. Keep our eyes cast on eternity, but also remember that these results, they may not be the results that we're wanting. We may still have to deal with a whole bunch of Marxist agendas or whatever to be opposed with. But God said we'd always face opposition. He didn't say it'd be a walk in the park. Let's make sure we keep our faith in God and trust that He is the one that will protect us and guide us and will come soon. But let's not lose sight on our purpose and the time until He comes. Dr. Rod, thank you once again for taking your time to share with us today.
It's always a great pleasure to be with you, Craig.
Awesome. And guys, once again, thank you for watching. We thank you for being a part of our community. It's really encouraging us to start seeing, the people that are viewing these, and we hope that you're getting something from this. I hope that your leadership is being challenged and that you're considering new ways of approaching leadership in your own world. And if you are seeing any value in this and you're seeing something that is helping your personal leadership, give us a thumbs up. And please put a comment below. We'd love to hear how this has impacted you personally with your leadership, because that's what our focus is here, is just taking these metaphors to help you become a better leader so that we all together can fulfill our mission of eradicating poor leadership. Make sure you give it a like, comment below, and subscribe to the channel if you would like to see more of this content. Thank you very much once again, and we'll see you in the next episode.